Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings, and today we are on the final installment of Anne McCaffrey's Pern series that I will be covering on this channel. But before I talk about all the Weyrs of Pern, I have to go back a step and talk very briefly about Renegades of Pern. I'm not talking about this book in sum total, mainly because a lot of it, I read it, I own a copy. As you can see, it is in fact a somewhat worn copy. But the thing about Renegades of Pern is that there's a lot in it that I didn't really like, though, some things were interspersed in it that I did. But there's a lot of stuff in there that just kind of didn't really interest me. And, it's fine. It's stuff that's not to my taste, not that it's bad. I was in this for thread fighting dragons and much less for socio-political commentary about underclasses in society who are marginalized because they're not like other people, with possibly commentary as regards, I don't know, Roma or something, but anyways, the point is that it didn't really grab me. But I bring this up more because one of the facets of Renegades of Pern, particularly as you come up on the end of the book, is this newfound Pernese fascination with archaeology. And that is because in Dragonriders of Pern, we see the first stirrings of this as Falar is desperately trying to find anything and everything from ye olden days and the ancients to try to find some clue to help with thread, to deal with thread, to stop things. And you see these first stirrings of it. You see it in The White Dragon, where they rediscover Landing, that is, the place where in Dragon's Dawn the initial settlers from Earth first landed, which was why they called it Landing, and just all of these things. But in Renegades of Pern is where we really see a sort of a launching point for the people of Pern to really just start being super fascinated, because this is like if we discovered actual credible evidence that Aztec pyramids were built by aliens or something. And people are always fascinated by ancient history, and this is, after all, history from 2,500 years before. And, 2,500 years before the present, we're talking, ancient Rome and ancient Greece and ancient Egypt. So we've got some very, very hefty historical distance, and they're looking at Landing, at these buildings built out of materials that they've never seen before. They're looking at shuttlecraft, and they don't know what it is or how it works, or even a theoretical construct of how it might work. They're looking at all of this stuff and finding it fascinating. And Renegades of Pern is where we really see this particularly taking off. It starts with significance in The White Dragon. But Renegades of Pern covers a couple of years of active hunting, of people finding these old settlements and saying, wow, there's this building that's still here, we can just move in. And then we get to the final chapter of Renegades of Pern, where they find Avis, which is an ancient AI that Avis is an acronym for Artificial Intelligence Voice Address System. And we have this this artificial intelligence that the settlers brought with them that was supposed to sort of run their central computer, and is one of the things that they were forced to abandon when the volcanoes erupted and everybody was forced to leave landing. I mean, they had already been thinking about leaving landing because, it was hard to protect people from threat, and if everybody moved into cave systems, then you're under stone and you don't have to worry about whether or not thread can manage to eat, your buildings, which was one of the first problems that they had during the first fall, was people living in homes made out of pressed vegetation or wood or what have you that just got eaten. So we have this moment at the end of Renegades of Pern where they discover Avis, and all the Weyrs of Pern picks up basically a half an hour later that the last sentence, the last paragraph of Renegades of Pern is the Avis system starting to tell them how humans made it to Pern and what happened. All the Weyrs of Pern picks up with the last thing Avis saw before all of its solar panels got covered by falling volcanic ash, and it was unable to functionally, have any contact at all. And so all the Weyrs of Pern then is this story of, and I do think of this as the end of the series. There are books that come after it, that were written after it. There's at least one, if not more, that are set after it. But all the Weyrs of Pern is, to me, sort of the culmination and the end of the story of the dragonriders of Pern, because for all that one can talk about how, people would still want dragons around, the fact is that we know that at the end of the long interval that the numbers of dragons at Bendon Weir had been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. They didn't have a full weir anymore, and we know that by the end of this last pass that the dragons would have smaller and smaller clutches, have smaller and smaller numbers, and would eventually die out, just by virtue of their not being needed anymore. I mean, you might still have a population, certainly, but they wouldn't be, in a few hundred years, they would not be remotely what they are at the height of their powers in all the Weirs. Which, in its way, of course, was the fundamental ambition. Anyways, so we get this story of Avis, which, like I said, it's an artificial intelligence, and it is an intelligence in this book. It is depicted as very much being something that has its own thoughts and ideas and preferences and motivations. And we know this because, among other things, Avis, at the end of all the Weyrs of Pern, effectively shuts itself down. It commits suicide, in a way. And Avis's effective death, not the destruction, by the way, of the actual database, but the destruction of the AI that had been running it, that is coincidental with Master Harper Robinton's death. And the thing about Master Harper Robinton is that he has been a seminal, key, fundamental, central figure in this series ever since the first book, ever since Dragonflight, that Robinton has been the biggest supporter of the Weirs, one of the biggest supporters of Falar and Lessa, one of the driving voices of progress and unity and all of these things, and his death also marks the end of an era at the end of all the Weyrs of Pern. This is very much a book of endings. It's a book where, by the end of the book, well, yes, the rest of the pass is still going to happen. This is going to be the last pass of thread. This is the book that, in its way, really does mark the end of the Weyrs as what they were over the past 2,500 years, of their place as, standing against Thread, as protectors, as all of these things. That's at an end. That's going to stop. We have, we have an end of this period of ignorance of their, points of origin. We have an end of the era of Master Harper Rabinton. We have the final sort of end of the last person, in effect, to remember the settlers who first landed on Pern. That this closes the book on the series, and whatever else may have been written in the series, and I did read Dolphins of Pern, and I have issues with it that make me exceedingly cranky with the book, which is one of the reasons why I'm not going back to it. But All the Weyrs of Pern is it's a book about so much social upheaval and optimism and hope from those who believe in progress, and anger from those who believe in tradition, and just so many things. That this particular book is one that to me, this is where the series stops. I can't bring myself to look at any other parts, because this is the stopping point. This is the final point. And while I'm sure that there are other books that fill in gaps in history and so on and so forth, I never felt any urge to read any other things after this one, because in this series after this, because this was it. And you'll notice the white dragon on the cover, and that's because, of course, Jackson and Ruth are fundamental, central pieces of Avis's puzzle. That Ruth's ability to sense when he is in time, to always know exactly when he is in time, is a central piece of how the Weyrs manage to dispense with Thread. In effect, they use their dragons to teleport the engines of the 3 orbiting spaceships, the colony ships that had been left in synchronous orbit around Pern. They take the engines off of those ships and cart them over to the Red Star, and then use them to effectively blow it out of its then current orbital path. And there were 2 previous long intervals which Avis turns out to have calculated were caused by time-traveling dragons dropping those engines off at previous points in time, and that it turns out that Ruth's job is to, in effect, get the dragons back in time to the appropriate points to cause those long intervals. So it's an interesting, it's a very interesting thing, because, of course, this is where the science part of this being science fiction really shines through, because a lot of this reads more like fantasy. It's very, very loosey-goosey. This is not hard sci-fi. But it's also definitely not fantasy, and these aspects of time travel, of spaceships, of all of this really do drive home that point in a way that many other aspects of parts of this series really don't. Anyhow, I think I've said all I'm going to say, in no small part because I am hitting the end of my self-appointed timer, so that's all for Anne McCaffrey's Pern series from me, and I will see you all next week.